S. Pomej. Serial Murder on Kepler-452B. Sherlock Holmes, The Galactic Cases, Episode 3, based on the characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A goaudio production. Captain Decker spontaneously decided to make a detour to planet Kepler-452B in the Cygnus constellation to visit his former instructor. The 1,800 light-years from Earth were merely 2 or 3 hops for the Ultimo 1. With its mass 1.6 times that of Earth, the exoplanet impressed the visitors of the approaching spacecraft with its size and presented itself mysteriously shrouded in clouds. A little visit from a former star pupil will surely delight him, Decker confidently told himself, though visibly nervous about the imminent reunion, as he fidgeted with his blonde hair like before a date. "Certainly, sir," Tornot agreed. "And for the other guests in this retirement home, your appearance will surely be a welcome change of pace." Holmes, who stood beside him on the bridge, exchanged meaningful glances with Dr. Watson, who was also present, before remarking, "You must have been his most well-behaved pupil then, Mr. Decker." "Yes, I must flatter myself," he smiled. "We got along very well. I admired him back then." The robot Elmer, an impressive 2-metre-tall, gleaming figure made of steel and flexible plastic parts that gave his head a human-like appearance, stepped forth straight away from an opening wall panel carrying a silver tray, upon which lay a blue package with a lovely bow. "May I take the liberty, sir, of pointing out that Admiral Willcox celebrated his 225th birthday 2 days ago. Therefore, I thought it appropriate to select a gift for him on your behalf." "How thoughtful of you, Elmer," Decker said with delight as he slipped the small package into the side pocket of his golden uniform. "225? Dr. Watson repeated in disbelief. "If he was your instructor, then during your training he must have already been a good 200 years old," Holmes deduced, equally incredulous. "Yes, he was active for a very long time. Usually one retires at 198. Decker fidgeted with his uniform. "He was probably bored without any intellectual challenge," Tornot surmised. "Speaking of challenges," Holmes interjected, "could Dr. Watson and I come along? We'd quite like to see what one of these retirement homes is like." "Fine by me." Decker didn't seem particularly pleased about it, but he didn't want to turn down the 2 Englishmen. "Shall we take the shuttle once again?" Holmes inquired. "No, we'll take a space elevator down," Decker announced, already making his way to the lift to reach the airlock, and barked an order towards Tornot. "Prepare Ultimo 1 for docking with the space elevator." "Is that one of those moving rooms that goes from the heavens down to the planet?" Dr. Watson inquired. "No, more like a gondola that extends far into orbit, you'll see," Tornot reassured him, and Decker clarified. "The competing forces of the stronger gravity on planet Kepler-452B and the stronger centrifugal force at the upper end create tension in the cable along which the gondola travels up and down with cargo or passengers. We'll board through the gondola's airlock at the top after our ship has docked, and then glide swiftly down in it, where we'll travel directly from above into the feudal estate and can disembark at our leisure." "Well, that sounds rather inviting," Holmes said cheerfully. "Yes, you won't need to change into your spacesuit for the transfer," said Tornot. "Would you like me to come along, sir?" "No, you stay aboard and may act in my stead." "What a shame! I'll miss your feeble jokes," Dr. Watson hissed before the lift doors closed. There was a slight jolt as the Ultimo 1 touched the pod's airlock. Whilst crossing through, both Holmes and Dr. Watson noticed a slight feeling of dizziness. It felt as though they were standing on heavily swaying ground. Decker showed no reaction, as he was already familiar with such space lifts. Behind them, the airlock doors closed with a quiet hiss, whereupon the pod set itself in motion, and they could distinctly feel themselves moving downwards. "It's perhaps a bit late to ask, but are your ears all right, gentlemen?" Yes, why? Holmes wondered. In rare cases, the eardrum can rupture during rapid descent if it fails to equalise the pressure. The 2 gentlemen from the past looked at each other briefly in shock, but said nothing. Dr. Watson made some chewing motions to relax his jaw and the captain grinned briefly. "One more thing. Don't be surprised, Dr. Watson, if we encounter Mrs. Bascom, the care home manager. She has significantly more brain volume than ordinary people." Decker prepared him for the meeting. "That's delightful. We do rather enjoy the company of intelligent ladies, don't we, Holmes?" "Yes, Watson. That reminds me of Irene Adler at once." He adopted a dreamy expression, but immediately suppressed it in favour of his usual matter-of-fact, rational countenance. Through the small viewing slits of the space elevator, they could see white-grey cloud masses that seemed to reform every second. Finally, there was another jolt as the pod glided into the retirement home. The doors opened with a soft hissing sound, revealing a large hall laid out with a red carpet on light grey marble flooring. Mrs. Bascom, an emaciated figure, was already standing there to greet them, wearing a white coat with yellow pinstripes, beneath which 2 thin, yellow-stockinged legs peeked out. "Good Lord!" Dr. Watson burst out, clapping his hands together in horror. "The poor woman has hydrocephalus." "Dr. Watson," Decker called him to order, "I did tell you earlier that Mrs. Bascom possesses a larger brain capacity than ordinary people." "Oh, and that's why her head has become so—" Decker quickly interrupted the doctor. "And that's why Mrs. Bascom has a slightly larger head than normal people. After all, the brain needs quite a bit of space." Indeed, Mrs. Bascom had a truly oversized head, with her now somewhat offended face situated in its lower third. Her forehead was 3 times higher than that of normal people, and was only sparsely covered by thin corn-yellow hair. She had applied so much mascara to her eyelashes that they looked like tarantula legs. Now the doctor looked somewhat lost, stammered a half-baked apology, but Holmes saved the situation. "I find this head has quite a special charm." "Thank you," Mrs. Bascom hissed at him and immediately turned away. "Welcome, Captain Decker. I'll take you straight to your mentor, Admiral Willcox, who will surely be delighted to see you again." With small, mincing steps in her chunky white orthopaedic sandals, the care home manager hurried ahead of them. The building gave the impression of a hospital, as the walls gleamed in clinical white, occasionally adorned with photographs of turquoise oceans, and there was a pleasant temperature along with an eerie silence. They could hear only their own footsteps after leaving the red carpet. A short while later, they entered a leafy courtyard where several elderly gentlemen, who could hardly have been older than 90, sat on wooden benches in red, white and blue striped pyjamas feeding the pigeons. "How lovely that there are pigeons here too, so far from Mother Earth, our home," Holmes said with delight. "Those aren't real pigeons," Mrs. Bascom explained to him. "They're electronic ones that merely give the impression of real birds." "Ah, but the food is real," Dr. Watson estimated from a distance of 30 metres. "Yes, they're pieces of cake," explained the care home manager. "When a pigeon is full, it flies to the kitchen where it empties its load into a pot so our chef can make rum balls from it." "How extraordinarily economical," remarked Holmes with raised eyebrows. "Quite right," she nodded. "We don't believe in wasting anything here." "I hope I'm not disturbing the Admiral," Decker worried. "No, he's just having his daily bath in the whirlpool," she revealed, and led the 3 visitors into a glass-enclosed room where said bubbling whirlpool was located. A scent of eucalyptus greeted their nostrils, and several decorative vines snaked down from the ceiling. "Admiral Willcox, you have visitors!" the care home manager shouted loudly as she entered, stopping in front of the pool and staring into the water churned up by air bubbles. "Is it normal for his feet to be sticking out of the tub?" asked Dr. Watson cautiously, visibly trying not to put his foot in it again. "Oh my!" exclaimed Mrs. Bascom. "Quick, help me pull him out, Captain Decker." Together, Decker and Mrs. Bascom pulled him out of the whirlpool, but sadly it was too late. The pensioner in his red, white and blue striped swimming trunks had already gone into rigor mortis, and his lips had turned blue. "I believe resuscitation attempts would be futile," Decker noted sadly. Mrs. Bascom looked at the dead man dejectedly and said, "I have good news and bad news for you, Captain Decker. You've just discovered the bad news yourself. And the good news is, this man is not your instructor, Admiral Willcox. Oh? Then who is it? That's Mr. Crushumble, a lawyer from Ohio who was only 199 years old. He didn't get to enjoy his retirement for very long. There was regret in her voice. Mrs. Bascom, Dr. Watson chimed in, you possess more brain matter than all of us combined, yet you managed to confuse two pensioners with each other? No, she protested indignantly, waving one of her bony hands in dismissal. The two look very similar and must have swapped treatments. It happens quite often. Some pensioners love surprises. I dare say he wasn't expecting such a lethal surprise here, remarked the doctor in a distinguished manner. That was clearly murder, Holmes stated, pointing his index finger at the dead man. I can see dark marks on his neck, possibly caused by strangulation. But fortunately for you, I am here and will solve this case most expeditiously. Decker looked up and asked, Isn't there a CCTV camera here? What about privacy? The care home manager countered with a question. Look, Holmes, exclaimed Dr. Watson, pointing at the hot tub. There's a rat swimming in there. No, Mrs. Bascom dismissed. That's just Mr. Crushumble's toupee. Around the age of 178, hair follicles gradually cease their activity. Vain gentlemen still insist on wearing old-fashioned toupees. Are all your guests here gentlemen, actually? Holmes wanted to know. Yes, because women make themselves useful to their families until death, and therefore... She left the sentence unfinished. Dr. Watson finished her sentence. They don't end up here in the retirement home. We don't say retirement home here, Mrs. Bascom snapped at him resolutely. Just as we don't say numbskull. I've already apologised for that. Irritated, she left Dr. Watson standing there and hurried over to a frail old man who had just tottered in wearing an exoskeleton to reprimand him. Mr. Lingham, you were supposed to do your walking round the house today, and what's more, your last 2 monthly payments for your stay here are still outstanding. When do you intend to settle these? As soon as my great-grandchildren transfer the money, you'll receive it, promised the old man, and tottered back outside. You should have raised your great-grandchildren better and taught them the most basic rules of human interaction, she whined after him. It seemed clear that she was still annoyed about Dr. Watson's hydrocephalus remark, and was now using poor Mr. Lingham as a lightning rod for her frustration. What a shrew, Dr. Watson muttered. Holmes nodded silently, and they both quickly slipped away. After a few steps, they reached the back entrance. A glass door opened onto a lovely wooden veranda, from which one could see the dense jungle a short distance away. The humidity was extraordinarily high, and the foreign sun blazed as if it wanted to grill everything beneath it. Some distance away, a narrow path led along a small stream into the deep green thicket of the verdant jungle. In places, the greenery bloomed in brilliant red, and one could practically feel how intensely nature presented itself here. It smelt of damp wood and rather like horse manure, although no horses were likely to graze here. Oh, this primordial vegetation looks absolutely splendid, gushed Dr. Watson. Don't you agree, my dear Holmes? He merely muttered non-committally. I know what you're thinking, Holmes. Even in such a paradisiacal setting, there's murder and bloodshed. Yes, my dear Watson, the world is perfect wherever man does not intrude with his torment, as Friedrich Schiller already knew. A large sign reading warning stood on a wooden post between the veranda and the jungle. When an elderly man wrapped in a red jumpsuit, sitting in a motorised cart, drove onto the veranda, he stopped beside Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson and inspected them with bulging eyes. A plaster adorned his bald head, and a urine bag hung at his side, with a small tube leading into the crotch of his jumpsuit. I say, my good man, what does that sign over there mean? The elderly man sized him up from head to toe and croaked, That sign means almost nothing at all. What's that supposed to mean? Dr. Watson pressed further. That means that a man happened to pass by here with a large bucket filled with black paint. Then he dipped his brush in and painted letters on the sign. The man is very old indeed, Holmes whispered. Perhaps the sign warns him not to leave the premises, lest he lose his way. He! The old man suddenly burst out laughing. What's so funny about that? Asked Holmes, surprised that the old man's hearing was so good. If you've got a bothersome wife, here's where you can easily get rid of her, croaked the old man, and, still laughing, drove his mobility scooter back from the veranda into the building. That's what you call senile dementia, Dr. Watson lectured his friend. Could be. Do you feel that pulling sensation in your stomach area too, Watson? No, rather a rumbling from my empty stomach. Precisely. I'm also tormented by hunger. Let's make our way to the dining room, but let's forgo the rum truffles. Meanwhile, Decker had found his instructor, who was in the library amongst old books, wearing a blue and gold polka-dotted dressing gown and a cap with a gold emblem. My respects, Admiral Willcox. Reporting to pay you a visit and belatedly congratulate you on your special day. After delivering a crisp salute, he handed over the gift that Elmer had wrapped. Hello, Decker, my special student who always knew everything better, the Admiral reminisced whilst curiously unwrapping the package. Oh, chocolates, and my favourite kind too. I fondly remember you, Decker flattered him. Do enjoy the sweets. No snacking until after lunch. Come along. Today we're having sautéed reptile innards. The Admiral tucked his gift into the pocket of his dressing gown and gestured for Decker to follow him. In the dining hall, around 80 pensioners were gathered around a long, festively laid table, chattering loudly and already stuffing themselves. A robot in the form of a sexy mannequin wearing black suspenders was distributing tall glasses containing a light blue liquid from a tray. Holmes and Dr. Watson rejoined Decker, who introduced them to the Admiral. They all observed the scene of noisy, chomping elderly folk. What's everyone drinking here? Dr. Watson ventured to ask Mrs. Bascom, who stood at the head of the table, also keeping an eye on the proceedings. That's plant nectar from the jungle, which the robots harvest every day. It tastes exquisite and also provides mental clarity. Wouldn't do you any harm, she said sharply and handed him a glass from the tray. Thank you very much, he muttered and took a sip. Smack, excellent. Do try some, Holmes. After Holmes had also taken a sip from the glass, one of the pensioners fell face first onto his plate and didn't make another sound. The elderly resident's chatter and smacking immediately fell silent as everyone looked around in shock. What's wrong with him? Asked Decker. Has he taken ill? Quickly, Dr. Watson rushed over to him, lifted his head and realised, dead as a doornail. Sniff. I smell bitter almonds, so he must have been poisoned. With hydrogen cyanide, Holmes specified, then added reassuringly, at least he hadn't taken a sip from his glass yet, so we can assume the nectar is safe to drink. The poison must have been in the food. At once, all the old men jumped up like young whippersnappers and sprinted out of the dining hall at record speed. How could this have happened? Mrs. Bascom asked herself. Well, we can assume that the poison was served to him on his plate. Who is the deceased? She asked Holmes. Mrs. Bascom examined the dead man, who was now slumped in his chair with his mouth agape and his head tilted far back, and then said, That's Mr. Rattlebone, a 201-year-old police officer from Minnesota. What? Does a police officer earn enough to afford your prices? Decker wondered. He was last stationed on Venus and regularly received heat allowances, she explained to him. Perhaps he also took bribes from someone, but that's not my concern. My concern, understandably, is for the other residents of my exclusive retirement home. After all, I have a good reputation to maintain. Who could possibly have a motive to eliminate these distinguished gentlemen? A lawyer from Ohio and a policeman from Minnesota? Holmes inquired with interest. Now you're asking too much of me, she said sadly. Neither of them ever received any visitors here. I know that for certain. You see, one must always sign the visitor's register. Have you done that yet, Captain Decker? Yes, earlier, before I came here with the Admiral, he reported. The Admiral confirmed this with a nod of his head. Dr. Watson had a sudden thought. Mrs. Bascom, You mistook this Mr. Cruchumble for Admiral Willcox. Perhaps the murderer made the same mistake. In that case, our honourable Admiral here would be in very grave danger. I shall defend him with my life, Decker boomed, thumping his chest like a gorilla. That's quite all right, my boy. The Admiral waved off kindly. I am perfectly capable of looking after myself. What about the staff here? Holmes wanted to get an overview of the personnel. Oh, all the staff here are robots, except for myself, the cook Shinsu, the nurse Mireille, and the orderly Roger. Since we can naturally exclude you from suspicion, Holmes said diplomatically. My investigation is limited to these 3 individuals. I suggest that I question the chef first. Mrs. Bascom had no objections and led Holmes, Dr. Watson and Decker to the kitchen. The Admiral preferred to return alone to the library, against his former student's advice, to continue poring over his book. I have never needed a bodyguard, he snapped, before swiftly taking his leave with remarkable speed. Well, at least he has the chocolates as provisions which are absolutely certainly not poisoned, Decker murmured reassuringly. In the chrome-gleaming kitchen, the Chinese chef Shin-Tzu was working on the dessert, a chocolate mousse. With elegant movements, he whisked the double cream until stiff and poured the melted chocolate from a carafe in a thin stream. Mr. Shin-Tzu, my name is Sherlock Holmes and I am a detective, commissioned to solve 2 murders here. Very pleased, mumbled the chef, putting down the carafe and wiping his hand on his appetizing lemon-yellow apron. Wish you much luck and success with that, mister. Above all, you'll need luck yourself, remarked Dr. Watson, as you are one of the main suspects. I'm not main suspect, I cook, he defended himself with growing agitation, waving the whisk around like a fencing foil. Do you use any poisons, for example for pest control, Mr. Shin-Tzu? Holmes asked him sternly. There are no pests in my kitchen, he swore emphatically. Well, he's absolutely right about that, Mrs. Bascom supported him. While there are insects outside, they find plenty of food in the jungle, so they've never bothered us here in the building. Right then, we shall search the kitchen, Holmes ordered, and immediately began peering into all the cupboards, drawers, and even the sink with eagle eyes. He was supported by the others, except of course for Shin-Tzu, who, visibly vexed, stirred his chocolate mousse with enduring grandeur. All the while, he muttered incessantly in Chinese, something that sounded like a curse. Nothing here that doesn't belong in a well-stocked kitchen, Dr. Watson noted, almost regretfully, after he had rummaged unsuccessfully through even the rubbish bin. From far away, a shrill scream reached them, which could undoubtedly be attributed to a female person. Aye! That was Mireille, Mrs. Bascom knew at once. She's in our infirmary. Come, gentlemen, follow me at once. Everyone except Shin-Tzu followed the rushing matron and entered a hospital room that smelt of disinfectant. On the bed lay a resident wearing only red-striped pyjama bottoms, lying on his back with an oiled chest, and beside him stood the completely distraught nurse Mireille, a blonde curled woman with a sun-tanned face. She was wearing a light blue nurse's uniform with a plunging neckline, white stockings, and yellow high heels. I had just given Monsieur Montesquieu his daily massage when he suddenly couldn't breathe anymore, she sniffled, as a tear rolled from the corner of her right eye. That may have happened because you're so pretty, remarked Decker with a wink of his left eye. Heart attack due to sexual arousal. Really now, Mr. Decker? Holmes scolded him. Surely this isn't the first time the nurse has treated him in that provocative outfit, so why would he choose this particular occasion to breathe his last? He told me he had already taken his medication that Roger gave him, Mireille interjected, brushing a blonde strand of hair from her face. Then he fell asleep under my hands and, practically died under my hands as well. That puts Roger in first place among the suspects, Dr. Watson noted. Where is the nurse? No idea, Mireille shrugged her shoulders. An hour ago he was still lurking about in the library. Good heavens! Decker exclaimed, and hurried back to the library to protect his former instructor. Holmes and Dr. Watson automatically followed him, while Mrs. Bascom and Mireille remained behind with the late Mr. Montesquieu to keep vigil over the deceased. Fortunately, they found Admiral Willcox alive and kicking amongst the old tomes. He was reading the book How to Stay 75 for 160 Years, A Guide to Healthy Aging. "Well then, have you already cottoned on to who the murderer is?" he inquired eagerly. "Unfortunately, we haven't found any traces yet, but a witness statement points to the nurse," Holmes informed him. Now, our cheerful Roger wouldn't hurt a fly," defended the Admiral. "He's always got a joke on his lips. When I met him this morning, he told me the joke about the robot who tells the returning husband about the unfaithfulness of the lady of the house and gets destroyed with an axe by the husband for it. I've rarely laughed so much." "You seem easily entertained," remarked Holmes indignantly, looking around the library. "Ah, just as I thought. Up here is a book about poisons and their uses." "Ah, and you think the murderer read it and tried it out straight away?" asked the Admiral, amused. "Really now, that would have to be an absolute amateur." "We all did something for the first time once," Holmes insisted, and Dr. Watson added, "including evil deeds." "Well, I have never done anything evil." The Admiral angrily snapped his book shut at this suspicion. "If I may say so, Admiral," Decker interjected, "you destroyed the moon of Blabalos without good reason, where several inhabitants were living. Those were merely mucus sac creatures that could be classified as vermin." Admiral Willcox worked himself up. "Just imagine if they had evolved to achieve space travel and fallen upon the humanoid population of Blabo 57C. Far be it from me to contradict you, Admiral, but I simply cannot imagine these slime creatures ever evolving to reach the atomic age. But they had already learned to use tools with sticks," Admiral Willcox persisted stubbornly. "From there, it's not far until—" "Gentlemen," Holmes interrupted, demanding the full attention of the two squabblers. "We have far more pressing concerns at present. We ought to find this joker and subject him to an interrogation. Roger should be in the gymnasium right now," the Admiral remembered. "After lunch, some of the residents want to whip their flabby bodies into shape. Follow the red line on the floor outside, and it'll take you straight there." Following the Admiral's advice and the red line, Holmes, Dr. Watson and Decker made their way there. In the said gymnasium, 3 elderly men sat on white stools in black shorts with bare chests, raising their hands high above their heads. A young man with a brown mohawk was encouraging them to swing their arms loosely from left to right. "And all together. Very good. Should you ever return to Earth, you can use this method to stop a flying saucer hovering above you," he joked. Left, right, left, right. "Mr. Roger," called Sherlock Holmes, "may I briefly interrupt your exercise class?" "If you must, what's the emergency? Are you also looking to secure a place in our facility?" asked Roger with a sunny smile on his broad face. His muscular body was clad in a green tracksuit. "No, we want to find out who is responsible for the deaths of 3 of your residents," Dr. Watson explained to him. "What? 3 of our cemetery deserters are dead? And they say all good things come in threes. My heart is breaking, although, given their biblical Methuselah-like age, one must always expect such things. May I point out," Holmes began to lecture him, "that according to the Bible, Methuselah lived to be 969 years old and did not die a violent death. Who died then, if I may ask?" "A Mr. Cruchumble and a Mr. Rattlebone and a Monsieur Montesquieu," Dr. Watson revealed to him. "Ah yes, the Chester, the Copper and the Frenchie," Roger counted off on the fingers of his right hand. "You employ quite a casual manner of speaking," Holmes criticised with a contemptuous look. "Did you not care for these gentlemen?" "On the contrary," claimed Roger with a smile stretching from ear to ear. "We all got along splendidly. As we've just learned, you gave Monsieur Montesquieu his medication. Is that correct?" Dr. Watson looked at him sternly. "Yes, he didn't want to wait for Slow Mireille, but I didn't send him or any of the others to their eternal rest." "Could it be that you are mentioned in their wills, Mr. Roger?" Holmes speculated. "If only," he replied spontaneously. "But I can't imagine that. Cruchumble kept going on about his great-grandchildren, Rattlebon about his young ex-wife, with whom he'd produced a few more little taxpayers, and the Frenchman had produced so many offspring that I can't even remember how many descendants he mentioned. "You're rather flippant with your remarks," Dr. Watson criticised. "Yes, that's why everyone here loves me. They need a breath of fresh air and not such stale, dusty characters like you and that other gecko over there." As he spoke, Roger pointed at Holmes. One of the elderly men sitting on the stools laughed heartily. "My grandfather used to wear a brown suit just like yours," recalled the other one beside him, pointing at Sherlock Holmes. "Isn't it peculiar, Holmes?" mused Dr. Watson. "We come from ancient times, and yet we're much younger than these pensioners here who were born after us. There'll be plenty of time for philosophising once we've brought these unsolved cases to their well-deserved resolution." The detective brushed a speck of dust from his shoulder. Decker looked helplessly from one to the other. He would have much preferred to be standing on the bridge of his spaceship. Roger approached Holmes. "So, for this meagre pay, I have to put up with being suspected by two random characters from long-forgotten aeons." "You're making it rather easy for us to suspect you, Roger," Decker chimed in. "With your big mouth and casual attitude, you seem to push yourself into the spotlight everywhere, don't you?" "Have you grilled our little cook yet?" Roger inquired, placing his hands on his hips. "I don't want to accuse anyone or snitch, but Shinsu told me 3 days ago that Rattlebone complained about his teriyaki sauce, which made him absolutely furious." "Yes, it really was hot," agreed one of the pensioners in gym shorts. "The sauce burned me twice, once when swallowing and once when "We can well imagine where," Dr. Watson quickly interrupted him with a disgusted expression. Everyone laughed, even Decker, but Holmes and Dr. Watson remained deadly serious and pondered. Finally, Holmes made a decision. "We'll question the cook again, although I believe he's innocent." "In court, it doesn't matter one bit who's actually guilty," Roger snapped. "All that counts is who you can prove anything against. Ask the legal twits. Oh right, he's already been done in." "He wouldn't have given any information without payment anyway," remarked one of the elderly gymnasts. "Well then, my dear old chaps, shall we continue with our exercises?" Roger egged them on. "Yes!" all three old men chanted in unison. Shaking his head, Holmes left the gymnasium with Dr. Watson and Decker in tow. "Disrespectful lad," he whispered. In the kitchen, Shinsu was just preparing sandwiches when he had to stop due to receiving unexpected visitors. After clearing his throat, Holmes asked, "Mr. Shinsu, have you left the kitchen recently? And if so, when?" "No," he replied quickly. "I practically live here. But at some point you must, need to relieve yourself," Holmes continued impatiently, whilst Dr. Watson nodded in agreement. "Yes, but I took care of that early this morning. Next loo break won't be until evening," explained Shinsu whilst continuing to garnish his sandwiches with smoked salmon rolls and gherkins. "Why don't you ask Morel?" "Who?" asked Holmes. Decker clarified. "He means Mireille. Yes, the nurse can be sloppy sometimes, giving elderly people the wrong injections." "They're bouncing us back and forth like a ping-pong ball," Dr. Watson observed. "We won't get anywhere without a motive," said Holmes. "But it wouldn't hurt to turn our attention back to Sister Mireille." At the infirmary, the nurse sat at a table before an assortment of small transparent plastic cups into which she was sorting various pills. "Yes? What can I do for you? Are you feeling unwell?" "Thankfully, we're all in perfect health," Holmes assured her. "But the cook mentioned that you've made several mistakes with injections on your patients." "What impertinence!" she raged, jumping up and angrily throwing the colourful pills onto the table. "Don't get upset, Sister Mireille," Decker pleaded with folded hands. "It makes women rather unattractive." In a somewhat subdued tone, she continued her venomous rant. "That food ruiner only said that to deflect attention from himself. Last week, all the residents had diarrhea. Indeed they did." "And you're blaming that on Shinsu's cooking?" Watson surmised. "Of course, his snake fodder completely upset the old folks' stomachs," she claimed brazenly. "I stopped eating his concoctions ages ago. I prefer to eat bananas that grow in our greenhouse. When did you last see the gentlemen, Mr. Cruchumble and Mr. Rattlebone? Holmes wanted to know. Well, I last saw this Cruchumble yesterday when he came for his vitamin injection, and Rattlebone also came to see me yesterday because he wanted an extra sleeping pill, she reported, now very composed again. Sister Mireille, do you happen to have any hydrogen cyanide lying around here? Dr. Watson inquired with half-lowered eyelids. Prussic acid? No, we don't use anything like that. It sounded rather snippy. You're welcome to look around if you don't believe me, and I need to powder my nose. After her departure, accompanied by the loud click-clack of her high heels, Dr. Watson, Holmes and Dekker searched the medical bay. They examined all containers which were meticulously labelled and peered into every little box, sniffed at all manner of substances, opened tubes and medication packages, but had to conclude disappointedly that nothing smelled of bitter almonds, and there was no other evidence pointing to the nurse as the perpetrator. To be honest, I wouldn't attribute the force applied to dead Mr. Cruchumble's neck to a woman, remarked Dr. Watson, but Dekker disagreed. Never underestimate a woman, especially not such an attractive specimen. Besides, I find her hands quite strong. In my opinion, this nurse has proper paws on her. Well, she needs to be able to get a good grip on the frail patients, the doctor said in her defence. Most of the patients here don't seem that frail to me at all. What about Mrs. Bascom? Holmes pondered aloud. We can't entirely rule her out. Who knows? Perhaps she stands to gain by making room for new guests here. Or she's simply mad. That's another possibility we can't completely disregard. Exactly, Dr. Watson agreed. Just think about her larger brain volume. Some form of madness could be hiding in there, possibly one that's still unknown to us. Dekker massaged the bridge of his nose. Yes, unfortunately with humans, there's always that possibility. That's why I prefer robots. Machines are reliable, have no abnormal brain patterns, no mood swings, never go on strike, and don't demand pay rises. They're the ideal workforce. And Holmes realised. And humans also possess quite a considerable criminal energy. Then we'll put Mrs. Bascom to the test, or rather, her brain, Dr. Watson announced, rubbing his hands together. Hydrocephalus or not. After a brief search, they found Mrs. Bascom in the retirement home's storeroom, where she sat at a desk between large crates and smaller packages in front of a computer, conducting an inventory. Ah, you've come at just the right moment, she said cheerfully, unaware of the impending suspicion. I've taken the trouble to reconcile all the goods with the delivery list here using a robot, and I've found some irregularities. What sort? Holmes cast a glance over her shoulder. It appears some of the goods have been pilfered without anyone noticing. Here, for example, a bottle of Tagestarov vodka, promptly delivered, but nowhere to be found. This means someone must have secretly stored the bottle somewhere private, rather than sharing it fraternally with the other residents as intended. That's very interesting indeed, Mrs. Bascom, but we're not looking for a thief. We're looking for a murderer, a serial killer in fact. Holmes mentioned this crucial detail, and Dr. Watson added, I also think it rather unlikely that the thief turned murderer over a bottle of vodka, regardless of the brand. Mrs. Bascom abruptly stood up from her armchair and scolded, That may be the custom where you all come from, but not in my house. I run a tight ship. Everyone must account to me for any consumption beyond their allocated ration. Ah, Dekker blurted out. And when that doesn't happen, you go completely mad, don't I have that right? Indeed. Then hang on a minute. She noticed the suspicious looks from those around her. Could it be that you suspect me of all these misdeeds? Yes, Holmes admitted. The thought has indeed crossed our minds. It's up to you, Mrs. Bascom, to dispel it. Now listen to me carefully. I have been running this exquisite establishment for half a century without the slightest complaint. I even have thank you letters from the deceased, framed and hanging on the walls of my private quarters. And by virtue of my office, I am also a moral authority here on Kepler-452B. Remember that. Yes, that does sound rather impressive, noted Dr. Watson. However, there are always times when we don't all function as smoothly as the cogs in a timepiece. Exactly, you have burnout, just admit it, Decker rudely demanded. The cheek of it, she fumed. With my superior intellect, I've never experienced anything of the sort. I have so much capacity that I could easily manage 3 more planets like this one, provided I had the necessary staff. In any case, I already have my own theory. Might we now be privileged to hear this theory? Holmes expressed himself as eloquently as possible, whilst folding his arms in anticipation. Be my guest. Well, I can only imagine that a spaceship landed on the other side of the planet, unloaded its human cargo of criminals, and one of them managed to fight their way through to here. Rather far-fetched. Decker shook his head. Why would anyone cart criminals 1,800 light-years from Earth through space, just so they could commit their crimes here? Firstly, humans haven't lived solely on Earth for a long time. Secondly, people like you, Captain Decker, have spaceships that can take shortcuts through quantum tunnels. And thirdly, there are plenty of lunatics among them. So there. Her last word sounded defiant. Decker covered his eyes with one hand as if he were tired. Sherlock Holmes took a deep breath and then inquired kindly, "And which of your human employees do you believe capable of these deeds?" After brief consideration, she said, "All 3 of them. The cook sometimes gets in a foul mood and oversalts the soup. The nurse can be rather tetchy during her monthly cycle and mixes up the injections. And the orderly sometimes has too much of a silly sense of humour and plays foolish pranks on the elderly residents." Dr. Watson pushed out his lower lip before objecting. "Well, you're not being much help to us." Holmes spoke again. "We must get to the perpetrator through the victims. Mrs. Bascom, did any of the victims complain about any of your staff?" "Yes, they're all constantly complaining about every little thing that doesn't suit them. Mr. Crushumble complained that Mireille doesn't kiss him goodbye after his injection. Mr. Rattlebone complained about the chef because of the teriyaki sauce, and Monsieur Montesquieu complained about Roger, who made a joke about his noble ancestry. And nobody complained about you?" Decker made sure. "No, not that I'm aware of. I'm merely the recipient of all complaints," she lamented. "Besides, I possess a great deal of patience, which is quite necessary when dealing with so many elderly people who think they know everything there is to know." "Let's start over from the beginning," Holmes suggested, "and specifically in the room where the vat is. By mutual agreement, they all went to the whirlpool, where the lonely toupee of the late Mr. Crushumble was still floating about, or rather, being driven around by the rising air bubbles." "Where is the corpse?" asked Dr. Watson. "The robots took him to the cold storage," said Mrs. Bascom. "The medical app determined death by strangulation. So one was strangled, one was poisoned, and one fell asleep after taking his medication and receiving a massage," Holmes summarised with a raised index finger. "The medical app also detected poisoning in Monsieur Montesquieu, specifically an overdose of sleeping pills," Mrs. Bascom explained. Dr. Watson paced back and forth restlessly. Poison is often favoured by the fairer sex, but despite the nurse's strong hands, I cannot imagine that she would simply strangle one of her patients." "I see it exactly the same way," Holmes agreed. "Women usually stay loyal to their poison and don't dirty their hands on their victims' necks." "But Crushumble died in the water," Decker recalled. "She could have washed her hands straight away." "Mr. Decker, stop playing the fool," Holmes criticised him. "We are making a serious effort here to find a dangerous serial killer before he can continue his spree. What do you make of this, Mrs. Bascom?" Decker addressed her as she appeared lost in thought. "I must make a confession. Oh, it's so awkward," she hedged. "You see, I received an electronic mail earlier. In a blackmail letter, they demanded the sum of 1 million Bitcoin to stop the murders in my retirement home. I was supposed to transfer the sum to an account on Mars, but I thought it was just a joke." "What are Bitcoins?" Holmes was unfamiliar with such things. "Invisible money that we use to pay," explained Decker. "Peculiar," pondered Dr. Watson. One pays for visible things with invisible money. Who comes to mind immediately when we talk about money? Holmes posed the question to the room and, after an artful pause, answered himself. Roger, who spoke of poor payment? Evidently, he's dissatisfied with his salary here and found an illegal way to increase it, not even shying away from murder to emphasize his demands. Come along, let's go to his private quarters and have a look around, Mrs. Bascom suggested, already hurrying ahead in that direction. The four of them made their way to the lower floor of the retirement home, where Mrs. Bascom, without knocking, opened a white door adorned with a yellow smiley face. They all entered the stuffy 25-square-metre room, which contained an unmade bed and was in considerable disarray. This looks like a hasty escape, Holmes observed, pointing to open drawers and objects lying on the floor. Oh, and there's the missing bottle of vodka, Mrs. Bascom exclaimed delightedly, pulling an empty glass bottle out from under the bed. Such a scoundrel. Gets himself drunk and then acts as innocent as a newborn babe. All of a sudden, the light flickered and dimmed slightly. What's going on now? Asked Decker. Energy crisis? Looking up at the ceiling, Mrs. Bascom worried. It seems Roger has removed an energy cell. He's probably building himself a weapon. He's very technically skilled. He carried out almost all the repairs. But where does he want to go now? Decker posed a crucial question. The space elevator leads to a dead end because the Ultimo 1 is orbiting the planet whilst I'm down here. Mrs. Bascom explained. In case of such a failure, we've parked a space glider in a cleared area 11 kilometres from here. I'm certain he's trying to get there right now. And I am certain, said Decker confidently. We can intercept him before he reaches it. Come along, gentlemen. All three men hurried away while Mrs. Bascom called after them. Be careful! Along a trampled path, likely left by the fleeing Roger, the brave trio made their swift way through the alien jungle, where plants grew wild and beautiful. Unlike in Earth's rainforest, however, they heard no birdsong. It was so quiet that one could have heard the dewdrops falling from the leaves. Moreover, a heavy sultriness made itself felt. Above them, grey clouds heralded approaching rain. Strange that here in this alien nature, the sign with the inscription "Caution" comes to mind, remarked Dr. Watson after several minutes of brisk trotting along the beaten path. Oh yes, what I completely forgot to mention, Decker began somewhat sheepishly. Back on Earth, only 10% of all animal species use venom for defence or attack. And things are different here? Holmes feared with a rising sense of concern. Yes, somewhat. Here it's 90%. The remaining 10% are ape-like prey animals, which includes us humans. You really should have informed us about this earlier, Mr. Decker, remarked Dr. Watson in a grumpy tone. I didn't expect that we would need to venture out into the wilderness. Just stay close behind me, and I can defend us all with my neutron beam bracelet. And they built a retirement home in such a dangerous environment? Holmes couldn't believe it. As they walked on, Decker said, Oh, the creatures are quite fussy. They only eat young human flesh, not people who are 100 or well over 100. Even the bony matron certainly isn't on their menu. But, Dr. Watson interjected, beginning to stutter. Then we must also be among their preferred faux food. That's right, Decker agreed with him. We're all well under 100 so-called UHUs. Stop joking around, Holmes scolded him. I'm afraid this is no joke, Decker insisted. Here, amongst all these ancient pensioners, we're practically crispy teenagers for the predators. You must be pulling our leg, hoped Dr. Watson. No, absolutely not. It all sounds funny, but it's really true. These reptiles may only be 5'6" when they stand on their hind legs, but they shouldn't be underestimated due to their venomous fangs. May I draw your attention to the fact, Holmes addressed him from behind, that I am an excellent fencer and boxer. How lovely for you, Decker said cheerfully. But that's of rather little use to you here, unless you happen to have a retractable sword in your trouser pocket. And I've got this nagging feeling that your fists are sadly out of the question as weapons against these prehistoric creatures. No chance. What if we start a fire? Asked Dr. Watson. Holmes has tobacco and matches in his jacket pocket, knowing him as I do. The wood here is far too damp, said Dekker. I suggest we stop talking now, or we'll attract more hungry specimens of the sauropods. The two English gentlemen fell silent and followed Dekker in single file, constantly glancing left and right into the vegetation. Dr. Watson brought up the rear of the valiant group, feeling increasingly uneasy. To make matters worse, he stumbled over a root and fell. After picking himself up, he brushed some soil from his jacket, which cost precious time, and suddenly found himself alone, though not for long. Unexpectedly, a light green dinosaur emerged from the dark green foliage to his side, stood up on its hind legs and changed colour like a chameleon. It turned toxic yellow and drew closer. As it opened its mouth with a hiss, Dr. Watson could see the two venomous fangs, similar to those of a cobra but somewhat longer. He even thought he could see venom already dripping from the teeth. He stood there as if paralysed, whilst the predator came within striking distance and breathed its foul breath upon him. "Stand to attention!" bellowed Dr. Watson, as he had done in his prime military days. The sauropod hesitated, as no prey had ever reacted to him so brazenly and seemingly fearlessly before. He closed his snout, concealing his fearsome set of teeth, grunted, and uncertainly awaited a further reaction. "Right turn!" Dr. Watson bravely commanded. This command, however, the creature no longer understood, began hissing again. Its crest swelled, and it opened its mouth once more, baring its venomous fangs. As it moved to attack, it suddenly crumbled to ash, for a beam from Dekker's neutron bracelet had struck it from behind. "Dr. Watson," Dekker called out with relief. "I heard your unmistakable voice and rushed straight back to you. Where have you been? We must press on." Behind him, Holmes appeared as well. "I must express my appreciation, my dear Watson, for falling back on your commanding voice when faced with the beastly foe." "That's a pedagogical technique," Dr. Watson admitted. "It unsettles predators when humans behave differently than what they're accustomed to." "Quick, we must press on," Dekker urged again, and ran ahead in the previously chosen direction. "What if the murderer slips away right under our noses?" asked Holmes, who was running closely behind the captain. "It's enough if we get within a kilometre of the space glider. Then I can still send a beam from my neutron bracelet after it during takeoff, which will severely damage it and force an emergency landing." Dr. Watson had also caught up and exclaimed excitedly, "Well, next shore leave I'm staying on the ship." Breathlessly, they panted through the jungle, hoping that none of the dangerous venomous creatures would appear again. Soon they reached a spot that was less densely forested. Right in front of them lay a small clearing with a watering hole, which Roger was using to drink. In his green tracksuit, he almost merged with his surroundings. As soon as Dekker and his companions came into view, he assumed an attacking position, aimed his weapon at them, causing them all to stop dead in their tracks and freeze as a precaution. "Don't move!" Roger screeched, threatening them with the rifle-like device, in the middle of which glowed the extracted energy cell. "With my homemade energy gun, I can pulverise all three of you, in the blink of an eye." "Do be reasonable," Dekker implored him, not daring to use his neutron wristband. If he were to raise his arm forward, Roger could pull the trigger much faster than he could. "You won't get away from here, Roger, at least not very far. The long arm of the law is very long indeed." "Pah!" Roger scoffed, wrinkling his nose. "I'm clever, very clever." "Did you really murder those poor old gentlemen for mere money?" Holmes tried to coax a confession from him. "They were anything but poor. They had stashed away loads of dosh, probably through dishonest means too." Roger defended himself. "That doesn't give you the right to kill them," Dr. Watson accused him. "How despicable to murder others over invisible money," Holmes said indignantly. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself." "I wouldn't dream of it. Nothing in this world comes free. Everyone's dancing around the golden calf and chasing money like the devil chases souls. So why should I be the exception?" "But you didn't get it," Dekker sneered at him. So give up, Roger. I'm in control and nothing can stop me. As soon as I'm in the space glider, I'll demand 2 million Bitcoin, or I'll destroy the entire facility with an energy blast from above. No one can stop me. The emerald green bushes behind him parted, and one of the sauropods emerged on all fours. Upon seeing the two-legged food before him, its skin colour changed from green to toxic yellow, just like the specimen that had targeted Dr. Watson earlier. Roger didn't hear it coming and was revelling in his apparent supremacy. And peculiar fellows like you lot certainly can't stop me at all. "Watch out!" called Dr. Watson, who wanted to warn the wrongdoer of the approaching animal danger. "Behind you!" But Roger didn't react. "Ha! That trick is ancient. Older than all of us put together. You want me to turn around, do you? Well, you'll be waiting a long time, until you're as old and bald as those grumpy old codgers." Behind him, the dinosaur was already rising up on its hind legs and padding silently towards him with an open mouth. "I'm not as stupid as you lot," Roger continued, completely unaware of the enemy creeping up behind him. "Ha ha ha!" Bang! The dinosaur bit him in the neck. His laughter died away. He staggered, fell flat on his face, and died as well. Dr. Watson waved his arms, and Holmes clapped his hands several times, causing the beastly attacker to retreat and leave its prey behind without taking a bite. "You saved the reptile's life," noted Decker, who refrained from using the neutron beam. "And Roger would have ended up in the particle accelerator anyway. Time and again, people are driven to crime by the false glimmer of money," Holmes pondered aloud. "Even by money they can no longer see." "I don't quite understand it either," admitted Dr. Watson. "If invisible money were simply abolished, and we all returned to a barter economy." "Oh no, that wouldn't make some wrongdoers any better either." Decker picked up the energy gun and slung the dead man over his shoulder. "That's it! Together we've brought the perpetrator to justice and can fly away from here." There was quite a commotion in the retirement home when all those present showed their appreciation with applause after learning of the three heroes' adventure in the jungle. Sister Mireille couldn't resist giving the captain a passionate kiss on the lips, and the cook Shin-Su presented Sherlock Holmes with a lovingly prepared reptile soup in a portable cooler. "I must express my admiration, my boy," Admiral Willcox declared solemnly. "I always knew there was a true hero in you, Decker." "Thank you, Admiral. I must take my leave now." "And we'll say goodbye too," added Dr. Watson. "Would you like Roger's job, Doctor?" Mrs. Bascom asked him with a conciliatory smile, batting her tarantula-like eyelashes. "No, thank you," Dr. Watson fended off. "Why don't you ask Tornot, the first officer of Ultimo 1, since he's always making silly jokes as well?" "Well, in that case, I'll simply advertise the position again," she decided. "With the prerequisite absolute compliance with the law." "Very good. That will surely only attract the most honourable rogues," Sherlock Holmes joked, and quickly disappeared with Decker and Dr. Watson towards the space elevator. You are listening to Pomej. Serial Murder on Kepler-452B. Sherlock Holmes, The Galactic Cases, Episode 3. Based on the characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A goaudio production